Hello, friends, and dairy products of all ages. I'm Cheese of Ages, and we're here today to talk about another D&D storytelling tip. And this isn't as common a problem as some of the other tips I'll be giving in this series, but considering I've run into it 5 times over the course of the past year, I think it warrants a little bit of discussion. Now, this isn't me complaining about my local DM that has done this twice. It's just because I said 5. He only did it twice. There's a lot more examples of him not doing, and that were not him. So this isn't just him. So I'm talking about, as you can tell down there, trapping your players somewhere. It's generally a bad idea for prolonged periods of time, or too soon, for multiple reasons. You generally don't want to, right out of the gate, shove them onto a deserted a deserted island that they implicitly cannot through any means escape from. You don't want to put your space pirates into the only station for light years taken over by pirates, where they can't get their resources because it's taken over and no one will sell them anything, and they get the feeling that they can't really leave, and that the gun is constantly pointed at their head. You don't want to shove them on another space station full of Tyranids, and that space station's supposed to be their home base, and this is the first mission. And they're stuck there with no means of escape or anything else. No baseline, nothing to do, everything going wrong, constant stress. You don't want to just trap them on some random island in the middle of nowhere after their ship crashed because some mage decided to make an entire cyclone around the town made of air elementals. I mean, what the hell was up with that? Generally, it's a bad idea to trap them anywhere for a long period of time, but within the first 5 levels, it's pretty much a huge, enormous no-no. For the following reasons. 1, if you do it right out of the gate, your players are, if you don't tell them this is what's going to happen, because you generally wouldn't, because you want it to be a surprise. If you don't tell your players that this is going to happen and then spring it on them, it's going to be jarring. The first few levels are the levels in which even veteran players spend getting comfortable with their characters and sinking into the meat of their character. New players that might not have played many sessions need this comfort zone even more. So you really don't want to just break that out. Even with veteran players, they're usually playing a new concept that they want to get comfortable with, and they want to figure out how their abilities work and how everything will flow, get comfortable and settled in. But if you have them go into a couple of fights at max, or just throw them right into it and trap them to a situation where the large bulk of the party is completely out of their element, it can be jarring, and it can lead to a disconnect between the players and their characters, and that will cut the longevity of a campaign considerably. And also another issue with this is that early on in the progression, everybody's gear, regardless of system, early on in progression will suck. If you trap them off on some place where they are cut off from the regular comfort zone of civilization and resources, you will remove a crucial element of their progression. They won't be able to actually, get their full progression. They'll hit level 2, and then they'll be like, oh, well, okay, and then it'll be fine, because their progression's normal. And suddenly they're still on this island a couple levels later, and they don't have the magic item they normally would, and how the math and the system's designed to do. Mind you, it's fine to, like, if you've planned out for and changed the math, but yeah, this can be real upsetting to a player not expecting it. They're suddenly thrust into the situation which they're out of their element. They haven't been allowed to get comfortable with their characters, and the progression they came into the game expecting. They expected to, like, go in, like, find the magicus items and, like, go into magic stores, interact with NPCs, and you're yanking them from the core building blocks of most role-playing game systems, and that's the role-playing element. If you trap them somewhere, and it's not a place where they can interact with NPCs, you're editing out half of the game. You're reducing the game to skill checks and combat. That's what you're doing. Because if you're not in Civilization, that means you're usually not interacting with NPCs that aren't hostile. You need a village or something, or an outpost, some prisoners of an evil guy. You've got to put something in there for characters to interact with. If your players are in there expecting to, like, talk to the tavern keeper or like the bar guy and, like, get a quest and, you know, go to the local, like, stables and pick up a horse and go out to a dungeon, and you instead put them on a desert island where they don't talk to anybody but that's outside of the party, and they're, you know, like, dealing with monkeys fighting for bananas, you know, and they're fighting off monsters that are on the island and going through ruins and never seeing another person. Or they're trying to, the most you'll get if you're handling it properly is they're trying to handle natives that don't speak their language. Large majority, some of the time, you know, you've got to make sure if you're trapping them somewhere, they will have some means of interacting with people. In the case of those space stations, where they're completely taken over, we did have some interaction with NPCs that were being ruled over by these guys, but they weren't really comfortable with talking to us, so you know, it was kind of a minimum. You know, and it kind of felt we had a gun to our heads all the time, so we weren't exactly in a position to do much. You know, we felt very constrained because of a miscommunication. It was a misunderstanding. But when you're... Here's a word of advice specifically for the DM I'm talking about in this particular example. If you don't want the players to not do anything, and you aren't trying to convey that their every move is being watched, don't every 3 lines of dialogue and every action they take tell them that somebody down the street looks at them and reports over a comm signal their activity. That tends to convey that they're being watched constantly. And then don't complain later when the group of roguish space pirates doesn't know what to do because they can't be roguish because they think they're being constantly surveyed. It's a miscommunication, but what do you expect us to think when you keep hammering into our heads that people are radioing in our activities every, like, 3 minutes? And an even worse example, in a game I was in which you were trapped in a space station full of constantly evolving aliens, and even the terrain was attacking us, there was no NPCs to interact with unless we popped them out of a jail cell, and there was no interaction going on because we were constantly freaking expecting the walls to kill us, and we were constantly fighting with, like, radiation, enhanced gravity, and other things that actually in the long run didn't actually make sense for the situation. But I won't go into that. So yeah, this leads into another issue. We've talked about lack of common game elements that are crucial for a thing in these trapped situations, and players not having proper advancement unless you hand it to them. And we've talked about a disconnect between the players and their characters. We've hinted upon the stress, and that point is where we're going to go in. There's a pacing problem here. Normally, with a campaign, you got your baseline of civilization, you build up because there's a crisis, then you come back down after the mission's over, then you go back to that baseline, and you go here and that. If you're trapped in somewhere, and you're fighting for survival, either by the fact that you're trying to get off the island for a prolonged period of time, and for session after session after session it's not working, or you're like trapped on this freaking station and constantly you're basically in a huge city-sized dungeon. What happens is the game starts, you go up, and the baseline's up here constantly. You know, that can lead to a lot of tension, players feeling uncomfortable, and if their campaign is baselined up here, and then suddenly you go back to this baseline later, what's going to happen later? You know, players are suddenly in the default and feeling disconnected because their baseline was up here for a long time. It creates another disconnect. That's a pacing issue. You don't want to start off all the way up here because you ain't got nowhere else to go. You know, I've made pacing issues myself where I started off too epic and the quest was there and suddenly the city's gone. You know, I've done it myself. It wasn't trapping anybody anywhere, but suddenly this huge quest where like the pacing is just shot out. I've made that particular sub-bit of this mistake as well. And finally, because this video is getting a little bit longish, a final point in which you don't generally... Well, not a final point. Actually, there's two more points. One slipped my mind. One major point. The next point in which you don't want to trap your players somewhere for too long, like more long than a dungeon. Don't keep them constrained too long. Don't force them into a situation where they feel alienated and useless and powerless, especially early on. It's because generally, if they're stripped of every one of their capabilities and they feel useless, especially early on with all those other factors pounding onto them, your players will start to feel agitated about the situation on a real level. It's not that their characters are agitated about the situation anymore. It's just suddenly because your players are like, oh, we're going to be on that island, or we're going to be trapped in that diseased city, or we're going to be on that freaking station again. You're stuck in the same area in a situation that makes a character feel powerless. And, you know, nobody's comfortable for a prolonged period of time. It's generally not good to start with that. You know, it generally just fucks up pacing a whole bunch. Generally, you don't want to do that until at least 5th level, maybe 3rd if you have particularly slow leveling or progression. And the equivalent with systems, you want to like let your players get established. Generally, as a rule of thumb, I wouldn't trap your characters anywhere for a prolonged period of time until they've solved a crisis of some kind. Like, they've gone through this big dungeon and found this, like, fell necromancer doing some stuff that's threatening the local town, and they bust his ass, and they stop him, and they have a nice little downtime, and they're like, ah, yeah, we saved the day. And then they get off on another mission and suddenly find themselves in a situation beyond their element. They've had time to feel comfortable, feel big and heroic. And they feel comfortable in their skins as their characters, and they've established what they can do, they feel comfortable with what they can do, and when they're taken out of their element, it's narratively more punchy, and it adds to character progression rather than stunting it or putting pressure on them too early. Yeah. Basic point, it will piss your players off in the wrong way. And the 5th and the final point, damn it, kind of slipped my mind again. Darn my short-term memory loss problem. Yeah, but yeah, the previous points will screw up the character's progression. It'll screw up the bond between player and character. It will deprive your players of elements like social elements and, you know, manipulating societies or like dealing with a society. It will take that element away from them. It'll like stunt your roleplay. considerably, and this is a role-playing game. It will make your players pissed off because they feel uncomfortable and powerless. It affects the pacing of the overall campaign and stunts further growth because your baseline was set too high. Bunches of reasons not to do this too early. This is a plot element. It's not a beginning. This is like... this would be like starting off... standard storytelling. Establish, crisis, resolution. That's a standard 3-act story structure. Establish, tribulations, victory. Same structure applies to an overarching campaign. You, right out of the gate, or after one quest, without much time for establishing, if you don't put in the establishing phase in your storytelling and start with crisis, you're not telling us the story in the right order or in the right process, and it can lead to disconnects or a not caring. I'm sure we've all seen movies in which they didn't have good character development, like these horror movies that frequently get like freaking insulted on the internet by internet reviewers, where you don't give a crap about the characters in the horror movie, so you don't really give a crap that they're getting murdered by the villain, and thus you don't find the movie scary or tense or anything. You know, it's the same thing. Imagine if you tried to... If a Spider-Man movie, like The Amazing Spider-Man, let's just... it's like taking The Amazing Spider-Man and starting with him fighting the lizard, and never including the origin, or explaining who Spider-Man is. You know, that's what starting out with a crisis and not putting in the proper building phase, the establishing phase of the campaign, will do. You've got to make sure your characters are established before you thrust them into a whole freaking huge thing. It goes into a pacing tip I will go over later, but this heck might have covered that too in the same video. Yeah, this is getting longish, and I completely forgot that other point I was going to hit. I might have hit it. So anyway, this is Cheese of Ages, signing off.